posted within a week of today. So we will go from there. Let's see if I can advance this. Okay, excellent. So this grants application training is for the FY23 or fiscal year 23, section 319 and 205J request for proposals. My contact info there is on the screen. Most of you, if you don't have it, go ahead and save that, especially if you anticipate submitting an application. You can reach me at any time at that phone number or my email address. And Travis, thank you so much for joining. We're just getting started, so you haven't missed too much.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so Travis, just so you know, I let these other folks know this webinar is being recorded. So just keep that in mind. You're welcome to ask any questions throughout the presentation today. Just a few housekeeping items. I do ask that if you can, mute your phone or your computer audio if you're not speaking, just to cut back on the feedback that we might receive. Again, you can use that Zoom chat function. It should be in your drop-down menu, little black bar associated with the Zoom website, or excuse me, with the Zoom meeting that we're on today. So you can use that, and then you can also send some feedback to me at my email there. Either I'll be looking at it throughout the presentation today, but especially after. So if you have some feedback or questions that we can't get at today, there's my email address for you. One quick note on the chat is you do have the option, if you just saw that arrow pop up, you do have the option to send a chat to everyone or just to me. So you can change that with the little drop down arrow. If you want to send a message just to me, feel free to use that feature in Zoom, or again, just email me. A lot of this is repetitive, but want to make sure you guys are aware of your options. So this webinar is a great time for general questions as well as project-specific questions. There's no pre-review on our applications. We stopped doing pre-review quite some time ago. So this is really a good opportunity to get those project-specific questions answered. We'll go through everything you need to know for submitting a proposal for the FY23 grant funding. And then just, to reiterate, you can call me anytime after this, but questions will be limited between now and when applications are due. So really, I don't expect you to have all of your questions lined out today. So if you're unsure, just go ahead and reach out to me, and we can go from there on whether or not I can give you further info. The biggie there is just to note there's no pre-review on applications or draft proposals. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? We're going to look at the Section 319 and 205J grants, the info that is required in the proposal, as well as some tips on how to submit a competitive proposal. We're going to go over how to submit a proposal, so the actual mechanism of getting that to me, as well as the whole process and associated timelines. This webinar, if you've attended in the past, this webinar has not changed too much from previous years, but we do have some things that that may be changing a little bit for folks that that may be familiar with the process year to year or historically. Okay, so we do have 2 federal grants available through the DEQ Water Quality Division non-point source program. We have the Federal Clean Water Act funding that is provided to states to address this non-point source pollution. The Section 319 grant specifically gets at projects that will reduce non-point sources of pollution to surface water and groundwaters. And then the Section 205J grant is not on the ground, but it is non-point source water quality management planning projects. So we will go through all of that information. And before we get started on that, though, I'd like to point out where you can find this information. So this is one of the things that's changed since last year. We had an update to our website at the DEQ, and now it looks a little different. So we have a new link here. I will make sure that you guys get copies of these slides so you can access all of these live links. But what you're going to want to do is go to the non-point source page, and then under the grant resources tab is where you can find the FY23 information. So for each grant, you'll see a memorandum and an application form. The memorandum is the announcement of the request for proposals and the guidance for how to apply. So that'll walk you through every step of the process that we'll be covering today. If you need reminders or just to make sure that you have all of the information that we need in your application. The application form has been significantly shortened and streamlined from previous years. I believe that first occurred in the FY18 application, and we haven't had significant changes to it since then. But one big thing to note is make sure that you're using the most recent application form that is on our website. If you have older application forms saved on your computer, just make sure you're going on there and getting that new one. That new one will have updated dates and formatting associated with this year's grant opportunity. What else do you need to review before you get started on your application? This is a lot of info. All of these different documents that you see here will give you more helpful info on 319 projects, and I really would recommend that you guys pay close attention to these as well, especially the sage grouse core areas. If you are in a sage grouse core area habitat, you will see that there's an additional requirement on that the application for your project, and that step goes through Game and Fish, and it's good to get started early. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then the watershed-based planning summary, again, we'll go over this in a little bit more detail in just a minute, but that summary is very helpful for folks that aren't familiar with what watershed-based plans have been approved in Wyoming for non-point source projects and these grant opportunities. You'll also see the 9 key elements of watershed-based planning. If you are anticipating doing some planning, I really recommend taking a look at that. And then we'll have the Section 319 evaluation and scoring sheet, as well as the 205J evaluation and scoring sheet. And then there's also proposal review guidelines for the non-point source task force. So you can go through that as well and see how the non-point source task force is going to be reviewing each application. And here is the general timeline. So the RFP was issued on July 29th this year. Here we are at August 8th for the training webinar. Final proposals are due on October 3rd by 5 p.m. There's more information in the memorandum and the application on that, as well as we'll be going over it today. And then October through November is when the DEQ and the non-point source task force will be reviewing these applications or proposals. And then after that, we will have our fall meeting, usually around November to early December. And that meeting is where we will have the opportunity to present to the task force your proposal. So that's kind of the big meeting for funding recommendations. We'll have presentations and then funding recommendations at that time. And then the federal allocation doesn't typically come out until spring or summer of the following year. So that's whenever we'll start working on agreements and things with those projects that were recommended for funding. And again, big red arrow just to hone it in, October 3rd, jot that down in your calendar. that is when final proposals are due this year. Okay, and just as a disclaimer, we do give our best estimate on the funding that we anticipate receiving from the federal government, but we are subject to congressional and presidential federal budget allocations and changes. So we won't know what our actual allocation is until next spring or summer. So just keep that in mind. Things can change. And if they do change, any further updates will be distributed through the non-point source listserv at this website. You can register for that listserv. I highly recommend doing that now if you haven't already. And you can actually choose to get other notices, not just the non-point source program there as well. So again, I'll send this presentation out so you can have all of these live links. So no need to write it down, but I do recommend getting signed up for that just in case things do change. That's where we'll be giving that information. Okay, so here's our first break. We're not going to stand up and walk away from computers, but I did want to just take a quick question break. You will see these throughout the presentation today. This is just a quick dedicated minute to check and see if we have questions. But again, you are welcome to answer or ask questions throughout the presentation as well. So does anybody have any questions at this time? Okay, so I'm hearing, oh, actually we've got one for Holly. And Holly asked, when will we know when proposals are due for FY24? That's a great question. So we do this on an annual basis, Holly. So this grants training webinar will occur again next year, and it'll occur after we issue the request for proposals for FY24. So generally we follow the same timeline. So you'll see that RFP come out in July. And then proposals are typically due anywhere between September 1 through the beginning of October, as you see it today. What we try and do is give folks about 45 business days to get that application in. So that's just why it can vary from year to year. But typically we're looking at RFP in July, and then applications being due September or October, just depending on how that falls. Great question. Any other questions that I can answer now? Okay, hearing none, we'll keep rocking and rolling. So we are going to first start with the Section 319 proposals. We'll go over 319 in detail now. We'll take another quick break and then we'll go over 205J proposals. So you'll note that they are pretty similar, but there are some nuanced differences between the two grants and their applications. So again, you will have the memorandum on our website to refer back to, as well as this training. If you have any questions, those are great resources to take a look at after today. And it'll go through pretty much everything that we're going to talk about now. So first things first, the Section 319 grant. This is all done through voluntary projects. So there is no regulatory mechanism for the 319 grant or the 205J grant within the non-point source program. So we have this competitive process for voluntary project applications to reduce non-point source pollution, to protect or improve water quality. And we'll see a little bit more on that in just a little bit. This grant is reimbursement only, which means that we can't give out funds ahead of time. Essentially what we need is proof of the work done first, and then the work can be reimbursed from there with this funding. What we try and do with this one is identify sources of non-point source pollution to surface water and groundwater of the state of Wyoming, and to prevent and reduce non-point source pollution such that water quality standards are achieved and maintained. So that's our main goal with this grant. And just a quick note on this one, you'll see more in just a little bit, but budgetary, this is at least a 40% non-federal match requirement, and that's 40% of the total project cost. So that'll be how much you're asking plus the match. And again, I'll show you how to calculate that here in just a minute. So what projects are eligible for Section 319 funding? Again, these projects are primarily on the ground work to improve water quality. So projects that demonstrate the real potential to improve water quality by reducing non-point source. So we have things like watershed restoration, which is projects on impaired water bodies to restore impairments or restore water bodies back to meeting our water quality standards. There are also watershed restoration or watershed protection projects, which are on the ground projects that protect an unimpaired water body. This grant can also fund outreach and education type activities or projects, monitoring and assessment, planning, technical assistance, and groundwater projects. So there is a broad eligibility to this particular grant, but there are some program priorities that we'll go over here in a little bit. Something important to note here is that there are quite a few project types that are not eligible for funding, and you can see those here. So again, since we are a voluntary project, we don't have any regulatory response with this, no point source projects. So, you know, the difference between non-point source and point source is pretty clear in that point sources, you should be able to point to them and say that that pipe is putting pollution straight into the water body. That's a very basic way to understand the difference. But again, we are focusing here on non-point source. If you think you might have some point sources in your watershed that you need to address, we are aware of other funding opportunities to assist with that. So definitely ask those questions or reach out to me after. Another one important to note, since we are a very agriculture heavy state, we cannot fund projects that have a primary benefit of increased production. However, it is important to note that if increased production for our landowners or our agricultural producers is a co-benefit to the water quality project that you are anticipating doing, it's a win-win for the producer and water quality. And we do see that quite often. So just note, it can't be a primary benefit, but we do have quite a few that are co-benefiting from these water quality restoration or protection projects. No purchases of real property, research, or anything in violation of local, state, and federal regulation. And then who can apply for Section 319 funds? Again, this is a very broad eligibility. You can see a list here of our most common projects by sponsor type. So conservation districts, nonprofits, cities, universities, state agencies, or other federal agencies, etc., can apply. Even individuals can apply, private entities can apply. But just note that projects with individuals are limited to demonstration projects. So that does have some limitations there. I think this most commonly comes up when we have engineering firms reaching out, and I think we may have an engineer on the line today. So what I recommend is if you are a private individual or a private entity, work with maybe your local conservation district, city or town or county to partner on a water quality project. We see that quite often. So next up, how much funding do we anticipate for Section 319 this year, and how much should you apply for? Again, these are all estimates, as we won't receive our actual allocation until next year. But we do estimate that a maximum of about $967,000 could be available in FY23. We determined this maximum based off of the previous award. And so typically we take anywhere from 3 to 5% off of our previous year's award. However, we have been seeing a trend of increases year over the past 3 to 5 years. So we kept this 967 estimate based off of how much the total amount that we were allocated last year. So there's no reductions here. Again, this can change. So just make sure you're signed up for our listserv. And then ultimately, if the project is recommended for funding, and we do have some changes, just know that those will be discussed proactively as we learn more from the federal government. There is no maximum project amount cap. I think in previous years we did have a cap. We have removed that. However, I do recommend to be conscientious and cost-effective as cost-effective as possible on what you're requesting. For example, in FY22, project funding awards range from about $20,000 to $300,000. And that can vary based on your needs. So request what you need, but also be ready to describe how you would phase your project. And I like to recommend this because we have been seeing phased approaches more commonly year after year. So if your project is recommended for funding and maybe it's not full funding, that's one thing that the task force will pay attention to, and I'd recommend having an answer prepared for is how would you phase your project both financially and logistically if you maybe don't receive a full funding recommendation. Okay, so I mentioned that we would discuss program priorities. So here are the priorities for section 319. High priority projects would be those watershed restoration projects that implement on the ground conservation practices to restore impaired water bodies. Impaired water bodies are listed on in our integrated report. The most recent integrated report was published in 2020. And you would want to look at the 303D list. And so if you aren't familiar with that, please let me know and I can show you where to find that information to see whether or not the water body that you're focused on is impaired or not. A watershed-based plan or an alternative plan is required for both the high priority and medium priority projects. We'll go over that in just a moment. But basically, you have to tie your project back to a planning document that has been approved as a watershed-based plan in order to be eligible for funding. So medium priority projects are those watershed protection projects, which are on the ground conservation practices to protect unimpaired water bodies. So if your project's focused water body is not on the 303D list of the integrated report, it is not ineligible. However, it would be considered a medium priority watershed protection project. And then what we classify as low project priority would be all of the other project types we mentioned that you can see here. Low priority does not mean that these projects aren't critical or important to water quality in the state. However, how we rank out in 319 funding, they will rank out lower due to state and federal water quality priorities. So our highest priority being that we want to do on the ground practices to improve water body or water quality in the state. It is recommended that you limit these projects to $50,000 or less, and that watershed-based plan or alternative plan requirement is not applicable to these lower priority project types. You may come in for more than $50,000 if there is a need. We have had that happen in the past. I would just recommend ensuring that you have strong justification for the funding that you are requesting at at that point. Okay, so again, we mentioned watershed-based planning. Watershed restoration projects must be implemented in accordance with a watershed-based plan that meets the 9 key elements of watershed-based planning and has been approved by the DEQ. The best thing to do here is, again, to look at the watershed-based planning summary on our website. That will tell you specifically whether or not your focused water body has an approved watershed-based plan on the books. If you are not sure whether or not there is an applicable watershed-based plan for your project, give me a call and we can take a look together, or I can point you in the direction to find more information. The 9 elements, the 9 key elements that you see here, these are requirements set at the national level by EPA about watershed-based plans. And it basically shows the steps that plans need to include to put on the ground funding towards watershed restoration projects or even protection projects, if that is the priority of the planning entities in that watershed. You may see in Wyoming that watershed-based plans often are done through the TMDL process. So many of Wyoming's TMDLs that have been published are considered 9-element watershed-based plans. But many conservation districts also write these outside of the TMDL process and submit those for approval by the DEQ to be eligible for 319 funding. So there's a mix that you will see in that planning summary. And then I did mention alternative plans, and this is in a very limited situation, case-by-case situation. For watershed restoration projects, you may submit alternative planning for your project. So if it's an emergency situation, for example, or you have a very small scale localized project, there is some flexibility there, and there is required information to an alternative plan that is listed here. So we still need to have an identification of the causes and sources, the goals, and how the project makes progress towards those goals, a schedule and milestone table for the project, proposed management measures, and any associated monitoring. Watershed protection projects at a minimum do require the alternative plan. So this is a little bit broader than watershed restoration, where we are quite limited in accepting alternative plans. So the big thing here I'd say is just reach out to me if you're unsure. The alternative plans do not have to be a standalone document like a watershed-based plan. You can pull together many different types of planning documents like water development studies, city and county planning documents, some state planning documents, et cetera, to help you meet these planning requirements. And I can assist with that process. The big thing to note here is if you anticipate using alternative planning documents, those have to be submitted and approved prior to submitting your application on October 3rd. So ask me early so we can determine whether or not you have everything that you need in order to get that approved to have an eligible proposal. Okay, so what do you need to submit for a 319 proposal? These things in red are the 3 main items that you'll be submitting. So it will be your application form, project maps, and a sage-grouse core area consultation letter if applicable. And we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. These things are required to have a fully eligible 319 proposal. So we will basically just need to ensure that you have all of these elements. I ask that you don't include any other attachments, such as letters of support or budget workbooks or cover letters. We just need these 3. And this really is is done so that we have a more streamlined review process for myself and the task force. So we've really cut this back from year to year in order to get back to you faster and get through this review process faster as it becomes more and more competitive year over year. One note on the project maps, these need to be as specific as possible. You can have more than one, and we will go over it in a little bit more detail, I believe, in a bit. And if not, I'll make sure to note back around what we would like to see in project maps here in a little bit. Note that too, if you are recommended for funding, you will be required to complete a more detailed project implementation plan or PIP and a budget justification with assistance from DEQ. So I will help you with those two documents if your project is recommended for funding. So the application, again, it's pretty general, streamlined, and straightforward, but just note that you should be prepared to give more detailed information in those two documents if you are recommended for funding. Okay, so the 319 application form is a 9-page fillable PDF form. I do ask that you do not modify this format since it is a fillable form. There should be no need to modify it, but just in case, I'd like to note that here. Make sure that you're using Adobe Reader. This is a free download. And then make sure that you're downloading and saving the application to a location on your computer instead of looking at it and editing it in a web browser. This is just to ensure that your work is saved and you can come back to it. We have had complications in the past with doing it in a web browser. Folks have lost their progress in that way. If you are a Mac user, I recommend opening the application with Adobe and not Preview, as Preview causes complications with the functionality of the fillable format. So just make sure that you are using Adobe Reader whenever possible. And if you have complications, you can always give me a call. So this is what the first page of the 319 application looks like. You have a project title section. This is a place where you can enter a very brief title for your project. You'll need to write this title over many, many times throughout project management if you're recommended for funding. So one thing that my predecessor Jennifer always said is save yourself some grief and keep it brief here. It will definitely help you in the long run. The project synopsis is where you can describe the project in public friendly terms. So make sure you're explaining this in a way that folks that don't understand technical terms, they can read this and understand what your project's going to be about and accomplishing. And also think about if this is the only thing someone would read, what would you want them to know? So it's a very brief item, but it's a very important one too. So pay attention here and just note that this will be used in program reports and outreach materials. So again, it's really important to have it written out to where everybody and anybody can understand what your project will be about. And then the applicant information is where you will fill out your organization name and the contact information. This is the entity that the DEQ would enter into a legal agreement with. So for example, we have Lisa Ogden with Natrona County Conservation District on the line. So her organization name would be Natrona County Conservation District, not Lisa Ogden or something, maybe something random, you know, that might be ancillary to the applicant itself. So make sure you fill that out correctly and double check that you're giving us accurate street address, phone, and email. And then the project location, latitude, and longitude. One thing that I will note there that I don't think I have here in this presentation, if your project is covering multiple areas within a watershed, we may ask that you provide more specific latitude and longitudes that is kind of on a case-by-case basis, depending on what information we can gather and share. So for the purposes of this application, pick a representative location for your project and enter that latitude and longitude in decimal degrees instead of degrees, minutes, seconds. If you have it in degrees, minutes, seconds, there are some conversion websites that you can use so that you don't have to do those conversions manually, and I can point you in the direction of those if you need them. For watershed names and HUCs or hydrologic unit codes, I recommend using EPA's How's My Waterway tool or contacting me in order to get that information. Especially the HUC codes, if you're not familiar with that, I can assist you in finding that information. And then there is a question on here that asks, are any of the water bodies impaired? And this is to help us again determine if you are coming in for funding for a restoration project or protection project. So you can refer back to the RFP memo or give me a call if you have any questions. And then here's more information on the project map at the very bottom. It should show sufficient detail to understand where the project is located in the state, where it's located in relation to the impacted water body, and then any other factors that are relevant, like watershed boundaries, land use, land ownership, major landmarks, any proposed best management practices, etc. You can include more than one map. We just ask to have each map in standard letter size, 8.5 by 11. Okay, next page of the application, you will fill out what your project type is, what pollutant sources you'll be addressing, what pollutant specifically you'll be addressing, and then the project time frame and project purpose. Please note, again, funds will not be available until next year, next spring of 2023 at the earliest, and that there is a associated date that all projects must be completed by, and that is November of 2027. Typically, our 319 projects are running anywhere from 2 to 4 years, so I recommend working within that time frame. For your project purpose, you want to be as specific as you can here and answer the questions that you see listed. What is the water quality problem? Why is the project important for water quality in Wyoming? And what are the project goals? So tell us here why your project is important, why it should be funded. And again, this is an opportunity to expand on the synopsis, but still speak in terms that are understandable to the general public here. Let's see. Next page, we'll cover the project scope and the project plans. So here, project scope, specifically, what will this project do to address the water quality problems? With a specific emphasis on the word do. So you want to be outcome oriented here, be very specific in what activities you will complete to reach those goals. So example of that would be if someone put, we hope to improve water quality through agricultural BMPs. You want to be more specific than that. So how will you improve water quality? What's the water quality problem? What agricultural BMPs are going to be going in? Basically here, what the task force is going to be looking at is if you did your homework on the project. Is there a very strong justification for the project? And do you know what you're going to do to achieve those goals? Okay, and then project plans. This is again where you'll want to list any planning documents. So watershed-based plans, TMDLs, any alternative planning, you would want to list that here as well, so that we can see your roadmap for your project. How do you know what you're going to do will be effective? So explain that here. Do you have a measure of effectiveness already set up? Please refer to the previous slide, the memo, and the documents on the website, again, for more information on how to, or for more information on watershed planning requirements And then make sure that you are addressing all of those requirements in this section. Next page of the 319 application will include project outcomes and project evaluation. And again, in the outcomes, you want to be very specific here. If you're familiar with SMART goals, you can use that format in order to fill this section out. You want to be more specific beyond just we're going to improve water quality, because not only do we want to hold each project that we do to an environmental measure of success, the entire program, the non-point source program, the 319 grant, we are held to certain environmental measures of success. So we need to be very specific here and tangible. What are the outcomes and deliverables? What's the environmental benefit? And again, instead of being process oriented, think product oriented here. So what are going to be the products after this project is done at the end of the day? So for example, what exactly are you going to implement in this project? If you have a septic system project, I'm going to fix 4 septic systems by doing X, Y, and Z. I'm going to address 2 acres of wetland complex by doing X, Y, Z, etc. Okay, and then in evaluation, this is a very critical aspect of 319, again, because we're ultimately held to measure of water quality improvement when we report back to the national level. We may step out of the application form, or we will step out of the application form now to discuss more of this, specifically evaluation and monitoring, considerations if you do monitor, estimating your pollutant load reductions, and then operation and maintenance for your project. So evaluation and monitoring, again, it can be challenging, but is a critical component of the 319 process. Data packs a very powerful punch. We can say that we are improving water quality and anecdotally that projects are working if we have good water quality data. Ultimately, we're trying to get watershed restoration and remove impaired water bodies from the 303D list. And data shows the improvement, whereas restoration may take a long time to show visibly, for example. If there are circumstances, though, where monitoring may not be an effective use of funds, there may be other options for you to consider in how you evaluate and monitor your project. So, for example, if the project implements BMPs where alternative methods like modeling are more appropriate to calculate effectiveness, you may not want to monitor for water quality. If the project is in a watershed where the project sponsor believes it is more appropriate to implement several phases of best management practices before effectiveness monitoring is warranted, you may choose to include a commitment to monitor at a later date and use alternative methods such as semi-quantitative, quantitative, or qualitative evaluation. If the project implements BMPs for which it is believed that several years, so beyond the scope of the proposed project and timeline, where we might need several years to realize water quality improvement, water quality monitoring during the 319 project may not be the best use of funds. And finally, a couple more safety issues, preclude monitoring, you may not want to or be able to monitor. So just include that information in your application. And then if there are other circumstances in which you may feel like you can justify water quality monitoring is not the best use of funds, those will be considered on a case-by-case basis. Again, see the memo for more information. But this is an element that is very closely reviewed by the non-point source program as well as the task force. So you'll want to think strategically and creatively about what success looks like for your project and then how you would want to communicate that to the public. Don't underestimate the power of qualitative or semi-quantitative methods. So like photo point monitoring, for example, or using riparian health indices. A great example of photo point monitoring is on the right. So you have before on the top and after on the bottom. That can paint a very strong picture for the measuring, not only measuring the success of your project, but communicating that back to the stakeholders in your area. For information and education activities, so if you have an information education activity in your restoration project, or if your project is solely information and education, consider how you would gauge whether these activities are effective. So if you are going out and doing a booth, an education booth, how can you measure the success of that? Here you can be creative. And you can also get some suggestions from me as well if you need some help there. Let's see. Lastly, one thing I'll note here on this slide is you really can think outside of the box here. If you have a non-standard idea to measure and evaluate the success of your project, put that in there in your application. Ask me. Things change from year to year. There's new, especially with this virtual time that we live in, there are new ways to look at how success may look for each project. So you can be creative and think outside of the box here if you are able and would like to. Okay, so some notes on if you do monitor for water quality. You will want to consider that these data may or may not be applicable for use support within the state. Primarily what we will be looking at in 319 monitoring is BMP effectiveness. However, we do have several projects in the past that have monitored for use support. If you do that, there is a very specific Wyoming method or process that we would like to follow. And what I would recommend is, most projects may not be ready for use support. There's nothing wrong with that. And it does involve heavy coordination and oversight with DEQ. And with 319 specifically, since we are looking primarily at best management practices on the ground projects, we may want to look more closely at monitoring for effectiveness. Again, your objectives may be other than that. So include it in your application, and just note that we may have further discussion either in the evaluation of your application or at that fall meeting to determine whether or not your monitoring objectives align with the project and align with the priorities of the program. Some other things that you'll want to think about: is it feasible to collect the information you need to meet your objectives? Will your results be conclusive? And is the scale of your monitoring appropriate for the objectives and questions that you're asking? So in your application specifically, you will want to describe your monitoring strategy broadly, and just note that this will be fleshed out if you are recommended for funding. So you'll want to, at a minimum, include the things you see on your screen here. Those are also outlined in the memorandum. So let's see. Yeah, so again, there are some considerations with monitoring. We do recommend, where resources are available, to do water quality monitoring. However, just make sure that you're fully considering this step as you submit your application. There is more information specifically on writing out your monitoring strategy and things to consider in that task specifically. And then here are some other more specific items that will need to come down the road after you submit your application. So again, if you do monitor, a sampling and analysis plan and a quality assurance project plan will need to be approved by DEQ before you can begin sampling. These are not required with the proposal, but just note that that will be a step in the process. So as you're looking at the timeline and you're considering whether or not you will be doing water quality monitoring, keep in mind that there are some additional steps that go along with that, with being the sampling and analysis plan and the quality assurance project plan. There are templates and a process for that. And if you have questions, you can reach out to me or I can put you in contact with our QA/QC officer who will ultimately review those documents. And then note, any data that you collect under a 319 grant will need to be reported electronically to the DEQ at the end of the project. This is a federal requirement, so I just ask that you keep that in mind. You are able to budget in time and money into your grant application to conduct these activities. And as a matter, I would highly recommend it. If you are coming in for water quality monitoring as part of your project, go ahead and budget in that time and money for those activities so that you do have the resources that you need to adequately conduct those activities. There are some state statutes to be familiar with. You can see those specific statutes on your screen. They are associated with trespassing to collect data and the Wyoming Public Records Act. Basically, again, with trespassing to collect data, you want to make sure you have landowner permission anywhere you go to collect data, that whoever owns that property is familiar with and approves of what you're doing and when you're going to be out there. And then with the Wyoming Public Records Act, any data or information you submit back to DEQ as part of a grant is publicly accessible. So just keep that in mind. And again, if your project's recommended for funding, more detail will be given on that through your project management training. So just note that, that you're familiar with those at this point, and there would be more to come. So if you aren't monitoring, or even if you are, the non-point source program is required to report estimated pollutant load reductions for 3 parameters: sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus every year back to EPA. There are some other pollutants like E. coli and selenium that are included in statewide annual program reports. And if you are implementing BMPs, you will be required to report estimated pollutant load reductions at the end of your project for, at a minimum, those 3 parameters. However, if your project is addressing a different pollutant, you may choose to report back on estimated load reductions where possible. So just keep that in mind. You are able to estimate your pollutant load reductions of projects that you anticipate completing as well. So if you are interested in seeing what your estimated reductions would look like, let me know and I can point you in the directions. Again, including those load reductions in your proposals can help communicate the measurable, tangible outcomes of the project. It's not required that you put those pollutant load reductions in there, but it is highly recommended. And a lot of times you can get that from your planning documents. You can reference back to the watershed-based planner, TMDL, for load reduction targets, and then specifically what load reductions your project may implement. Ideally, load reduction estimates are based on water quality data. However, modeling or other methods may also be appropriate. So we're going to talk about some commonly used models. The first one being spreadsheet tool for estimated pollutant load. This is an older an older modeling tool. They actually came out with a newer version that is online. You are still more than welcome to use this tool if you're familiar with it. There is training on the EPA website at this link listed. But I would recommend using this new tool. So it's called the Pollutant Load Estimation Tool. And this tool is replacing Step L, but it still uses the underlying formulas, but again, is in a more user-friendly format online versus downloaded as an Excel spreadsheet onto your computer. Both tools employ simple algorithms to calculate those required load reduction estimates, so nutrients, sediment, for many different land uses, and then it will give you the associated estimated reductions for different types of best management practices. For the most part, the practices that we implement in Wyoming can be fitted to this model, but if you are having issues getting a good fit for your proposed BMPs to what is included on the PLET tool, just let me know and we can try and figure something out together. There on the right-hand side shows the EPA's website. The only thing that I wanted to note here is that you can get the link and that training materials are coming soon for this tool. It was just published, I believe, in June, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but fairly recently. They are working on putting together similar training materials to the Step L tool. So more to come there. And we are working with EPA to see if we can get a demo scheduled over the next year for Wyoming stakeholders. Other modeling tools, so for stream restoration projects, commonly we see cross sections, as-built surveys, fish surveys, and the Roskin methods you see here, so Banks, BHI, and NBS. Any of those tools you may choose to use. However, some of these do require, if not all of them do require specialized training. And so you may choose to work with a consultant or someone that has experience using these tools that can provide technical assistance to conduct these types of, activities. We do have limited technical assistance availability within DEQ for some of these methods. However, there are quite a few of other entities throughout the state that can help as well if you aren't familiar. But basically, these will help indicate what the benefits are to the projects. And then the Roskin methods specifically give load reduction estimates and environmental pollutant reductions over time, similar to what the Step L and PLET models do, but a little more specific. Okay, other ideas for modeling tools you can see here. So runoff equations, annual surveys, engineering estimates, dredging and weighing, and then the DEQ septic system model. These are all other items, and this is not an end-all be-all list. So if there are other modeling tools out there that you are familiar with and would like to use, just let me know. We can take a look at it together to make sure that it gets you to where you need to be in your estimates. Okay, so switching gears just a little bit, but still talking in terms of evaluation and monitoring. I want to just touch on operation and maintenance quickly. In the project and evaluation section of your application, consider briefly describing how you will commit to BMP operation and maintenance. We want to ensure that these practices are effective for reasonable lifespan, and that you, again, are committed to keeping them operational. There isn't a standard associated with this, as each BMP kind of has its own lifespan, but just consider common sense estimates. Reach out if you need help in estimating what O&M may look like for a specific best management practice. And then the other thing that you may consider including in your application is any BMP follow-up monitoring, especially if time and resources allow and you aren't able to conduct water quality monitoring as part of your project. You may include a commitment for follow-up monitoring. Again, this is not strongly recommend, or this is not required, but it is strongly recommended. There is some guidance on our website from June 2018 that I can point you to. And I do have a bullet here that says more to come. And the reason being is that internally, our section at the DEQ is looking at monitoring for these types of projects a little more closely and reevaluating how that might look for funding in future years. So just more to come, nothing that affects eligibility this year. Okay, so the next page in the 319 application focuses on partnerships and outreach and education. Partnerships are critical in these funding opportunities. The task force will look very closely on this area to see if you've looked into other grant opportunities. Have you brought all the right people to the table for your project? What you want to do here under contributions tab is not just put financial contributions, but if you're getting technical assistance, volunteer service, supplies and equipment, or any other activities that would contribute to the success of the project. So if there's an entity that has skin in the game, list it and tell us what they'll be working on. You want to be as thorough as you can here. But again, it is limited in space. So just include the key partners, and then you will have opportunity to get at further partnerships down the road. So outreach and education section, just note outreach and education are not required, but they are recommended and can be very simple. So what you want to do is think about how you're spreading the word and getting others involved in your project. You can definitely be creative and think outside of the box here for social media or different classes and things. So just keep in mind, again, this is something that can be taken into consideration for competitive application, but it is not required, and you are able to think outside the box here a little bit. And then past project history. Basically, you want to see if you can give us the confidence that you have what you need to manage the grant funds. If you haven't had a 319 project in the past, describe other projects that you've done. Basically, again, we're just looking for that confidence factor. And then in the Greater Sage Grouse Core Area Protection, I recommend taking a look at the memorandum for a full explanation of what's required here. If you are in a Sage Grouse Core area, then you will need a consult letter from Game and Fish, and you will need to include that with the proposal. So go ahead and make this one of the first steps of your application as early as possible so that you can ensure that you have the materials that you need should your project fall within a core area. So essentially what we're looking for here is if you have a land disturbing activity, most commonly associated with 319 projects, within a sage grouse core area as defined on their sage grouse data website, you must obtain that consult letter and include it with this proposal. So plan ahead. Other information, this is an opportunity for you to get at any other information you would like to share with the non-point source program and the task force. If there are things that you were wanting to cover that weren't covered ahead of time in the application, you can describe that here. Again, just be brief and relevant as possible. A few special considerations for 319 would be if you are conducting irrigation best management practices, make sure you read through those requirements in the 319 memo. Again, note that that projects where increased production are the primary benefit, those projects are not eligible for 319 funding. So it's really important to pay attention and make sure that you are filling out an eligible application. Septic systems, we do have eligibility criteria for 319. So you can find that eligibility criteria under the sponsors tab on the non-point source website. That website's been linked a couple times, but I can include that on this slide too, just for easier access before I send it out to you. And then less common, but still important to note, if you are considering using microbial source tracking as part of your monitoring objectives and study design, make sure you read through the requirements. There are additional requirements associated with MST in the 319 and 205J memorandums. So the big thing here is just make sure you read that memorandum very closely and understand each piece of it carefully before you submit that application. So for the budget, there are 2 pages. The first page will give you kind of a very general view of how much money you're asking for, how much non-federal match you will provide, and then the total cost. There's also an option to put other federal funds in here. You aren't required to have other federal funds, and you're not required to, even if you do list, you're not required to list those out here, but you certainly can if you would prefer to. And it is common for folks to, especially with some of the common federal funding sources in the state. Non-federal match, what that means is basically anything that isn't provided by the federal government. So state funds, private funds, and landowner contributions count here. Non-federal match can be cash or in kind. So in kind would be volunteer services, equipment donation, equipment rental donation, basically everything but a cash donation would be considered in kind. In non-federal match must be accrued during the same time frame as your 319 project, but it's also up to 60 days prior to an active 319 project. So essentially, from the date that your agreement is signed, you can include match activities 60 days prior up to that date. And again, at least 40% of the total project cost must be non-federal match. So for example, if you're asking for $60,000, then you would need $40,000 to get to that 40% of the total project cost. A quick tip to calculate 40% would be to divide your requested 319 amount by 1.5. So in this example here, if you take 60,000 divided by 1.5, you would get that 40,000. So recommend writing that down or just referring back to this. It will change for 205J, as you'll see here in just a little bit. Couple other things on non-federal match. If you need estimates on different going rates for different types of jobs, you can find those on the occupational employment statistics provided by Bureau of Labor. The most recent one was submitted in May of 2021, and you can find that at this link here. Excuse me. And then the value of volunteer time for in-kind time donation for the independent sector right now is $29.95. This does typically increase year over year, so just make sure you're using the most recent value of volunteer time when calculating your in-kind match. And then after that general budget page, you'll get more specific. So you have in the top here your cost category, or your 3 major funding types of 319 funds, So how much you're asking, your non-federal match. So how much are you contributing to match the project? And then optional other federal funds. And then you'll have a description and explanation column to provide a brief description of the major expenses for each category. Again, if non-federal match funds will be used, identify those match sources. So example, landowner in-kind match, your conservation district's in-kind match, Wyoming Department of Ag funds, other grant funding, that sort of thing would go in this column. The cost categories for all projects will be broken down by personnel, supplies and equipment, contractual, and then other. And then you will want to total up everything from there. So one thing to note under supplies and equipment, any equipment purchases, so any, no matter how big or small they are, if it's a purchase, will need to be approved by DEQ and the EPA. Equipment is defined by EPA as personal property with lifespan of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. So if you're buying equipment that is $5,000 or $100,000, which is less likely, all of that will need to be pre-approved by DEQ prior to making that purchase. Again, there's just highlighting those different cost categories. Contractual, I don't know if it notes here, but let me see if I can pull everything up here really quick. Okay, so personnel and labor would be your entity's time, primarily. Supplies and equipment, again, any supplies that you might need to administer the grant would go here. Contractual would be if you're hiring a contractor to come out and do work for you, whether it be stream restoration or installation of irrigation practices or monitoring, anything like that would go under the contractual cost category. And then other, and then other is primarily catch-all for things that don't fall within these first three. Most commonly, it's used for mileage or postage, those sorts of things. And then finally, I think we will go over it. Yes, we'll go over it now. So there are limits on administrative costs. If you're recommended for funding, DEQ will work with you to more fully outline project tasks and complete a budget justification worksheet. The first task for every project, regardless, will be administration. So think grants management, reporting, budget tracking, indirect costs, etc. We can pay for these things under 319. You don't have to charge anything to this administration task, but you can. If you don't charge anything to it, we would still include it. So the thing to note here is that administrative costs are limited, and they're limited as follows. So 319 funds used for admin must not exceed 10% of the total funding award. And then the total funds used for administrative activities must not exceed 10% of the total project amount. So in the previous example, you can have a maximum of $6,000 of 319 funds for admin, and then you can have a combined maximum of $10,000 for 319 and match for admin. Just something to note there as you're filling out your budget, but we will get more specific and I'll work with you on making sure that we meet that requirement. So don't worry too much about it right now, but note that it will be something to take a look at later on. So I am looking at the time here. I'm thinking we might cut it pretty close, and you'll see 205J is pretty similar, but we're going to take a break in just a second for questions. This is the final page of the 319 application. It is a very critical page, as they all are, but make sure that you very closely read through and check off all of these boxes in order to have a full and eligible application. If you have questions, please call me ahead of time. You will want to sign and date this form. For the hard copies, only one copy needs to have the original signature. So we do have, when you mail these out, we will need to have an original wet ink signature on one of the printed copies. Every other copy that you print out will just need to have a copy of that signature. And the electronic copy does not need to be signed. So what I mean by that is in these last two checkboxes, you'll see that you're certifying that you will mail or hand deliver 14 stapled hard copies of the signed application form, project maps, and the sage grouse consultation letter, if applicable, to me by the due date. And then you'll also submit an electronic copy of those documents by the due date as well. And so it's really critical that you pay attention to that and make sure you're following all of these steps before submitting that application. Okay, we will take a very quick break. I'll look at chat to see if we have any questions. You're welcome to take yourself off of mute as well at this time. It looks like Holly had to hop off. Thank you, Holly, for being here. I don't know if you're still on. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Oh, so it looks like Holly's already hopped off. Lisa, do you have any questions at this point?
I do not. Everything seems to be pretty well the same as the previous.
Yeah.
And I will, I'm going to start working on the application here directly.
Okay.
By this week of some sort, I'll start working, and then Justin and I'll work on it. But
okay.
No, otherwise looks pretty clear cut.
Great. Okay, very good. Well, we will keep rocking and just let me know if anything pops up for you along the way.
Okay.
So, so 205J proposals, similar to previous years, except our funding, we anticipate will increase again this year. This is temporary, but what we're going to talk about again for 205J, this grant is water quality management planning only, as in previous years. So there's no on-the-ground implementation associated with this grant. Only local planning entities are eligible. So cities, counties, towns, and conservation districts can come in for this funding. That is a more limited eligibility than 319. And any planning, monitoring, assessment, feasibility studies, etc., are generally eligible for this grant. We do again anticipate $80,000 for projects this year. This has increased from previous years, and it's associated with the bipartisan infrastructure law that came out last year. And that is a temporary increase in funding, and it would still be subject to federal and congressional budget approvals. This grant cannot be used to meet monitoring requirements of any enforcement, permit, or regulation. And projects on impaired water bodies are a priority for 205J, as they are with 319. However, you certainly can submit an application for water bodies that are unimpaired. Just note again, priority ranking. This is also a reimbursement only grant. And the match requirement for this is reduced. It's a minimum of 25% of the total project cost. And it again would be non-federal match as well. So what do you need to submit for a 205J proposal? You would need an application form and a project map, similar to 319. Don't include any other attachments like a cover letter, letters of support, or anything like that. And if you are recommended for funding, you will be required to work with me on a project implementation plan and budget justification. The application form for 205J is very similar. It's a fillable PDF form. Just a reminder, don't modify that format and use Adobe Reader whenever you're filling it out instead of your web browser. in order to ensure that you're saving all of your progress. Here's the first page of the 205J application, very similar, and you'll refer to the same guidance as for 319. There is a separate 205J memorandum with more specific information on the 205J grant. So just make sure you're looking at the right RFP for the grant that you're thinking about applying for. And again, you'll go through the pollutant sources, the pollutants, the time frame, the purpose, and the scope. One thing to note on 205J is that there is a shorter time frame. 205J projects can be 2 years maximum, but more commonly we see 205J projects within a 1-year time frame. On the outcomes and evaluation page, as well as the partnerships, is the same guidance that we went over for 319. No major changes here, except for 205J projects, you will want to make sure in the outcomes section to talk about what you will do in the future with the project outcomes. So as you're working on this planning project, how will that inform future implementation, future action? That's really critical and something that the task force will look at. So basically, what are you going to do with the outcome of your 205J project? So for the water quality monitoring, again, you'll want to clearly think through your monitoring objectives and make sure that you're complying with the water quality monitoring guidance in the RFP. And then the budget is the same pretty much as the 319 proposal in terms of its format, but note that only 25% of the total project cost must be non-federal match. So again, that's reduced from 319. You can report more, you can apply for more than 25%, or you can report more than 25% in your application, but that is the minimum federal requirement for this grant. Quick tip to calculate the 25%, similar to the 319 grant, instead of dividing by 1.5, you'll divide by 3 to get that non-federal match requirement for 205J. So this example shows if you apply for 40,000, you'll divide that by 3 to get your 25% of the total project cost, which is $13,333. So you might want, again, to save this or refer back to it whenever you're submitting your application to ensure that you meet that minimum requirement. And then on the budget justification page, again, you want to be as specific as you can here in filling out each column and row, and the same 10% limit applies to administrative costs for 205J. So keep that in mind as you're working through your budget. And then on the signature page, refer to the same guidance as the 319 proposal again here, but pay specific attention to the 205J RFP. This application follows the same information in terms of mailing or hand delivering 14 stapled hard copies and submitting an electronic copy of your application form by the due date. So ensure that you read through these and understand every box that you're checking off prior to submitting that to me. And if you have any questions, please let me know. With that, Lisa, do we have any questions from 205J?
I do not. I've never applied for the 205J, but I know it's pretty similar. So
it sure is, yeah.
You've done good.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. We'll keep going. And I know we're coming up on 11:30, so apologize for going over a little bit. And if you need to hop off, this will be recorded.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so for submitting your proposal and the next steps, you would want to make 14 hard copies of your application packet. So that includes for 319, the application form, the maps, and the Sage Grouse consult letter, if applicable. For 205J, it's just the application form and the maps. So for both, no other attachments than that. If you do have a color map, we do ask that you print those in color if possible. Everything else can be in black and white. And only one hard copy needs to have the original signature. The rest of them can be copies. And please don't use covers or bindings on the hard copies. We just ask that you staple each packet together, and then mail or hand deliver those hard copies to me. That address is in each RFP memo, and that due date is 5 p.m. October 3rd, 2022. Any hard copies or electronic copies received after that, or received or postmarked after that, will not be accepted. So it's critical to ensure that you postmark those by that deadline and get that electronic copy sent over to me by that deadline as well. Electronic copies do not need to have a signature, and all documents should be in PDF form. So we try and give all of the materials to you guys in PDF format, so it should be pretty simple. I will send you a confirmation email when I receive everything. And if I do have questions at that time on the format or anything needing to be reformatted, I will let you know. So after that, after we get your proposals, I will review those, prepare comments for each proposal, and provide those back to the non-point source task force for their review. I will then send you comments, my comments, so that you can review those ahead of the fall meeting, where you will be given the opportunity to present, and we will go through funding recommendations with the task force. This year, we will be working on getting comments from the task force prior to that presentation as well. I do know at this time that the fall meeting will be in Casper, but the date is to be determined based on everybody's availability on the board, on the task force. So more to come there, and that information will be provided to you as soon as possible. The presentation, just as a quick tidbit, is a great time to fill in the gaps from your application. So make sure that you're looking at those comments and questions from me, and then hopefully the task force as well, and addressing those in your presentation. So what's really important here is just, this is more of an opportunity than just regurgitating what you submitted in your application. You can get more specific or address things a little bit differently. We will be looking for more than just that regurgitation, and that you have fully and thoroughly considered any comments or questions prior to presenting. Non-point source task force will make funding recommendations at the fall meeting. And then if your project's recommended for funding, I'll work with you on that project implementation plan and the budget justification. And then after the funds are released by the federal government, I will then work with you guys to set up an agreement between DEQ and the applicant entity. And the big thing to note here is the project is not active until a signed agreement is in place. So until we have a signed agreement, you would not want to do any of your proposed activities. And if you do those activities done outside of that project period, will not be eligible for reimbursement. Here's just a snapshot of the evaluation form for you guys. This is available on the website as well. The big thing to pay attention to specifically is the additional information requested from sponsor. This is where my comments on questions or suggestions on what to include in the presentation will go, as well as a key area to look at to address any other additional info that's needed. Here's a screenshot of the task force's scoring matrix. All of the scores are weighted, and this will be taken into consideration when making funding recommendations. The big thing to note is that we don't take the scoring matrices solely. We also have a funding recommendation discussion. So these are only a part to the puzzle when it comes to evaluating each project and making those recommendations. Something new that we have worked on again is this additional comments and or information requested from the sponsor. Hopefully we will have the mechanism set up to where we can share that back to sponsors before the presentations. However, if we aren't able to, that information will be provided after the fall meeting. So the evaluation criteria are listed here. I won't go through all of them, but this is listed in the RFP materials. The red are the top priorities, so I do want to address those. You know, we want to see that a project is addressing an important water quality need for the state, and that the project is designed to effectively address that need, and that the project involves appropriate partners and has significant stakeholder support. Adequate non-federal match has been secured for the project, and match sources are appropriate for the project. These are all these are two very critical components. And then the remaining information here, the green is medium priority and blue is lower priority, but still important to address in your application. And the application will be evaluated based on everything you see here, not just the red. So this information is all available on the DEQ's website under the Grant Resources tab. Also recommend looking at the FY23, not 22, that's a typo, Section 319 Proposal Review Guidelines for the Non-Point Source Task Force. That is in the Grant Resources tab as well. Everything that you see here, we have pretty much already touched on. We will send my evaluation form to you guys prior to the fall meeting, and then the task force will have the opportunity to provide comments back as well. Let's see. And then the big thing to note here is that last bullet point. So the more an application can demonstrate to the DEQ that the products from the proposed project are an effective and efficient use of funds to address the non-point source pollution planning and assessment specific for 205J, but this also applies to 319, the better chance the proposal has of securing funding. So just keep that in mind. Be as thorough as you can in your application within reason. We will have more opportunity to get more detailed and if your project's recommended for funding, but utilize as much space as you need and are given in the application to fully address all of the questions that you see, not only in the application, but also outlined in the RFP and then the evaluation criteria. Here's just a snippet of the 205J evaluation form and scoring matrix. And then if you'd like, you can also go back and look at the 2021 annual report available at that link. This will give you a better idea of what projects have recently closed and what projects were recommended for funding last year. So if you're wanting to take a look at what was competitive last year, go ahead and take a look at this link. And if you have any questions, just let me know. So that is all I have. In closing, I am available pretty much throughout the whole process to an extent. Again, outside of pre-review, you're welcome to give me a call or email me with any specific questions. If you're having any issues accessing any of the application materials, definitely do reach out earlier rather than later. And I wish you the best of luck and look forward to reviewing your proposals. And at this time, I will go ahead and stop my part. And Lisa, if you have any questions, we can talk through those. If not, you're welcome to give me a call or email me too.
Well, I do have one well, two actually. On the PDF, I know the last time I applied, I would fill out a certain portion and then I'd send it to Justin for him to look at, and then he'd send it back. There were a few times that when I sent it back to him, he lost the changes that I had put on there. Do you have any hot tips for PDFs to keep him from doing that? It's kind of a technical, yeah, because I'd type something new and then he'd be talking. He's like, "You didn't change anything." And I said, "Yes, I did."
Okay, yeah, so sure. What I would recommend first is making sure that you save a version onto your computer that has all of your changes prior to sending it to him. So that way, if he can't see it on his end, you can still see it on yours.
Okay.
Those changes should save and translate through email, but if they aren't saving, he may need to try, instead of pulling it up in a web browser, download it from the email first before
Okay.
pulling it up, so that he's downloading it onto his computer. That
Okay.
might help.
Okay. Yeah, got very confusing, but we figured it out by the end. And then right off the top of your head, I went to the Game and Fish. Do you know who's the contact for the Sagegrass program nowadays?
I don't have their specific contact information off the top of my head, but I will take a look and send that over to you today.
Okay, sounds good. I'll do a little research too. It used to be Amanda, but I think she has gone on to bigger, better things. So, okay, sounds great. Well, if you find out who it is, let me know, and I will do vice versa. But no, otherwise, very good presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa, as always. And yeah, I really appreciate everybody, and we will talk very soon if you're applying.
Sounds great. Thanks a bunch.
Yeah, thank